All right, so today's lecture is all about this chapter where we were introduced to two different additional types or case studies really in how to apply system dynamics modeling, one in the case of urban growth and the other one in a more sophisticated case of fisheries regulation. And I want to get into that. Just minor announcements that the schedule going forward is getting kind of simpler and simpler. There's just a muddiest point due this weekend. That's all you got. No more homework assignments. Then next week we have the next week we'll bring. Let me bring that up there. Next week we'll discuss the last chapter that we'll read in the book, chapter 10. That's for lecture F3. Then on Thursday, we'll have a lecture that's not based on the book reading, but where I will introduce chaos and randomness and how those two things play into effect with these complex systems. The week after that, we're going to do breakout rooms again on Tuesday, so you can come together and spend the class time working with your group and getting feedback and help from Eric and I bouncing around. Then Thursday of that next week, so 2 weeks from today, Eric will give a guest lecture on some of the things that he does with quantitative modeling and in some of the work he works on. And then that will bring us to the last week of class, where Tuesday we'll have a final exam review, similar to our midterm review. Your projects will be due that Wednesday. And so those are things you upload to Canvas. You'll upload your report and you'll upload your presentations. And then Thursday of the last week of class, we'll have stage 1 of the final exam. So that stage 2 will be that Tuesday of finals week. And so that's going to be set up just like the midterm. So the Thursday of the last week of class, you'll get 90 minutes to take the exam. And then the Tuesday of finals week, you'll get all day to do the group-based stage 2. So set up exactly like the midterm, same length as the midterm, same time limits as the midterm. So that's kind of everything going forward. So before we get started into the chapter, are there any questions about organization moving forward? I can say that Eric has been doing a phenomenal job getting grading back much more quickly than I often see sort of on average from TAs that work with me, and I thank him for all of that effort. And because of that, then your grade estimation in the grade book should be pretty good. There's very few outstanding grades out there, so everybody should hopefully have a feel for how well they're doing right now. All right, so let's march on into here. And then, Eric, in case you don't see it, there's some additional appreciation in the chat. So the first part of this chapter, which I'm going to try to go through a little bit more quickly because I'd like to get to the fisheries example because there's a lot of cool stuff that I want to introduce using the fisheries example. But I like this urban dynamics example. It's kind of a popular one. And it's another example of some work that Forrester did that was controversial and I think still is controversial. Questions about, are Forrester's models overly simplistic? And so what can we take from them? And even if they are overly simplistic, can they still be useful models for thinking about urban dynamics? So basically there's this common observation that you get a city and you plot it over its history and you get the formation of the city at some point in the past, you get this growth period, and then suddenly you, after the growth period, there's kind of a period of stagnation. And so the question kind of comes down to sort of saying, well, is this stagnation inevitable? Is there a way it can be prevented? Is there a way for us to hold it off until later? What are the processes that go into this stagnation? Well, because it's such a very common pattern in cities, then it's probably not just something due to some random external driver. It's kind of like, I use the example of an asteroid hitting the Earth. Well, the asteroid, if it's a small asteroid, it's only going to have a local effect. And so if it hits one city, it'll knock out that one city, but all the other cities should be fine. But the fact that we see it across lots of cities that don't appear to be connected to each other suggests that it might be a reflection of the kind of internal workings of all cities. So that kind of is taking the endogenous perspective that there are systemic forces that end up being the causal drivers of this stagnation effect. So we then ask, what observable processes might be working in concert inside a city to generate this pattern? And that will allow us to generate these dynamic hypotheses that we can then build a model that has all of these dynamic hypotheses in it. And then we can see if our model also generates the same patterns we see in the cities. And if it does, then that seems that, well, maybe we have figured out what causes this pattern, and maybe we can use our simulations as kind of toy models for cities for us to test policies. But if it doesn't work out, then maybe there really is something else that we're not thinking of that generates the stagnation pattern. So this was kind of the context of things when Forrester got together with this guy, John Collins, who was a big mayor of Boston. And when Collins kind of retired from being a mayor, he joined the faculty of MIT and had an office kind of down the hall from Forrester. And so those two, I think, would have lunch together or something like that. As all good, as all good research directions start, they usually start in a bar or at a restaurant or whatever, as people just kind of chatting, realize that they might have some common interests and common tools. And so, Collins and Forrester got to talking about this common pattern, and Forrester thought, well, maybe we could research this. And Collins had the clout to be able to pull enough researchers together to give Forrester the kind of workforce he needed to build system dynamics models to test these ideas. Well, that's kind of the context of what went into Forrester's, what eventually became his urban dynamics that he published on his model for how this worked. And so we can take this as a model for science or for sustainability science, where this kind of, and this is the kind of the abstract view of Forrester's preliminary dynamic hypothesis for urban growth and stagnation, is that this is a hypothesis. It is a possible answer to a research question. So that is, we're not saying that this is what happens in a city. We're saying this is what we think might be happening in a city. And we are going to say, if this is happening in a city, then we can build a fictitious city in simulation that only has these parts. And if that fictitious city that only has these parts generates the same patterns we see in real cities, then that lends evidence that maybe this hypothesis for how a city works is actually how a city works. So that's kind of where we come from, or what we mean by dynamic hypothesis. Hopefully this is becoming more clear as we move throughout these examples. And at the core of the dynamic hypothesis is explaining the growth part, because that's what all the cities start with growth. And so that's kind of the simplest part of this model. So whenever you hear growth, you should think reinforcing feedback. How can I build a reinforcing feedback into it? For bacteria, that's easy. Every bacteria produces new bacteria, which then produce their own new bacteria, and so on. So how do we get reinforcing growth in a city? Well, in that case, we've got new economic infrastructure that comes from the expansion of infrastructure. And so the idea here is we have some infrastructure, and so the new economic infrastructure that we build expands the infrastructure. And as we expand the infrastructure, then the thought is that over time, that is going to drive, so, okay, I got that kind of backwards here. So the expansion, this is the investment, the expansion infrastructure. So the idea here is, as you get new economic infrastructure here on the left, then that is going to drive there to be a pressure for investment in additional economic infrastructure. And that's what we see here. This is that kind of investment here. And then over delay, and this delay is like the time it takes to build the new infrastructure, you'll eventually get the new infrastructure. So here, this is kind of an infrastructure model of the growth of a city, that all of the city is kind of being grown by just infrastructure being expanded. The more infrastructure you get, the more pressure you get to build even more infrastructure. So that's our first kind of aspect of the dynamic hypothesis, which you can argue that there are other things that cause city growth or whatever, but his is built around this core idea. Now, once it's built around this core idea, then you have to sort of say, well, can you get this growth forever? And so immediately you think, well, there are some quick and easy limits to this. And one of this has to do with just land. There is a land limit that will ultimately prevent you from growing your infrastructure too far. The city only exists in a certain space. And once you use up all that space, then there's no way to continue to grow the infrastructure without getting rid of old infrastructure and then replacing it with new infrastructure. Wars are fought based on this idea that we need to grow our infrastructure. We have run out of space. There is someone next to us who has space. So we are just going to take over their space. And then that way we don't have to tear down any of our space to then build new infrastructure. And that's kind of what's being captured here. And so already we see reinforcing loop followed by a balancing loop. So already we're seeing hints of limits to growth. And limits to growth already has that kind of S-shaped growth. And so this already is feeling like this might be one explanation for that leveling off, that maybe we're just hitting our land limit. This is like the carrying capacity explanation, that the carrying capacity of a city technically is the amount of land it has to expand to. And once you expand it through all of the land, you've reached carrying capacity and you can do no more expansion. But that may not be the only way that things are limited. And so if we zoom over, then Forrester said, well, what are other ways that we could imagine limits? Well, we could say that there's going to be aging. So new in economic infrastructure over time is going to be old economic infrastructure, and it won't necessarily be as much of a thriving driver of activity in the city. This is a little bit like there's limitations that have to do with reaching capacity, then there are also limitations that have to do with just losing things. So if we talk about the harvested fishery, if we let the fishery grow, it eventually uses up all the resources in the fishery. But if we then start harvesting the fishery, then fish start getting pulled out of the fishery, and there becomes now a balance of the harvest rate and the regeneration rate. And that new balance will end up establishing the steady state level of fish at less than carrying capacity. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. If you think of the new economic infrastructure as the fish in the city, then as it transitions over time to old economic infrastructure, that's kind of like fish being caught through the harvest. And so there's this aging process where the new economic infrastructure gradually becomes old. And with more old economic infrastructure, you reduce the amount of new economic infrastructure. So this is another potential way that you're going to limit your growth. And then this old economic infrastructure, it is going to add, it's going to still be included in the total infrastructure. So it's not going to help with this land limit. And so the old economic infrastructure and the new economic infrastructure together take up the total infrastructure, which ends up being this, your total amount of land. So, these two things together, the fact that you run out of land and the stuff you're using becomes old and less useful, are two ways that will ultimately limit the activity of your city, according to this theory. All right, so then we say, well, what other things possibly could limit the growth of a city? And they may have nothing to do with infrastructure, at least not directly. It may have to do with the influx of people that come into a city. And so initially, a city has got a certain cachet, a certain attractiveness that pulls people into the city. And with that attractiveness, when people hear that, oh, Tempe is a really happening place, then eventually, if they say that, well, that sounds better than where I live in the attractiveness alternative cities, then that will end up causing people to migrate into that city. They'll start moving to Tempe. But as they start moving to Tempe, the urban population increases, it becomes crowded, there becomes more traffic, and there's all of these things that will decrease the level of attractiveness. And so I think Morecroft left out the minus sign here, but there should be a minus sign, which I guess I could draw in here on this arrow. And that will ultimately decrease the level of attractiveness. So there were a lot of questions in the perusal about how do you measure attractiveness? And this is something that you, inside your model, you can come up with all of these things that relate to urban population. Like I said, traffic congestion, smog, just generally psychological factors having to do with living in a high density area, crime. There are all of these different things that can contribute all, so imagine some mitigating factors here. So you could imagine a bunch of different variables which all relate to urban population that all have a negative impact on city attractiveness. And you could just come up with some index, and that city attractiveness might be, some the city attractiveness might be new infrastructure minus density minus traffic congestion minus pollution. And so if you add more new infrastructure, the attractiveness goes up. But if you add more smog, the attractiveness goes down. And it just has to have a qualitative match so that and then you could sort of adjust the weights of those things based on survey materials and those sorts of things. So you could build a model which would help you get from urban population to city attractiveness. And then from that city attractiveness, then that as your attractiveness goes down, then the number of people coming into your city might be reduced. So, so this ultimately, not only do you have a land limit, but you also have a population limit, which has to do with how attractive the city is relative to the other cities. Now, if you remember when we did the model of the EasyJet model from a previous chapter, then this is kind of like the fare of the existing carriers. And this was like the relative fare, you know, the existing carriers fare based on, and also the cheap fare. So the cheaper the EasyJet fare was, you got more consumers coming into EasyJet. But you could also imagine other cities are going to respond. As Tempe becomes more attractive, then Mesa will end up maybe, you know, putting pressure on, you know, there might be gentrification pressure in Mesa or down in Roosevelt Row. You know, as Tempe becomes more attractive and Chandler becomes more attractive, then Phoenix starts investing in innovating, you know, on Roosevelt Row to bring people back into Phoenix. And so gradually the alternative cities start increasing their attractiveness, and that will also end up reducing the attractiveness of the city we're looking at. In this model, we're assuming attractiveness is an exogenous factor that we can take as constant, as a parameter. But you could imagine building an even bigger model where you did actually model the dynamics of alternative cities as well and add that into it. There's a question of, does this lead to an endless cycle? And then, I mean, well, basically, I mean, all processes are endless cycles, especially if we're talking about sustainability. So this is sort of suggesting that whenever you live in a city, this is always going on. And the question is, do things reach a balance where things stop changing? Or are things going to continually be in flux? And what does it take to sort of continue the growth of a city? And so this might suggest that like all of these processes are always going on. But if you stop, say, investing in the expansion of a city, then that might mean that you necessarily are going to have to give up in city growth. And so that's kind of it. So it's kind of like a trade-off, like because all of these things, which I guess on my next slide I'll zoom out, because all of these things are always in play, then this is sort of telling you that if you stop expanding here, then all of these other things will end up causing you to sort of like more quickly stagnate. But even if you can expand, your ability to expand is going to be limited over time due to the land limit here. So you'll have to put a lot more effort into expanding. So ultimately, to maintain the growth of a city, what this suggests, perhaps, is that you might take $1 million for the first, you know, big chunk of growth, but for an equivalent percentage of growth, it might take $10 million for the next chunk and $100 million for the next chunk. And so this is sort of maybe suggesting that there's going to be exponential growth and the amount of you're going to have to invest to deal with these sorts of limits to keep up. And then if you've got other cities that are also trying to catch up with you, this is kind of like the EasyJet model with advertising. You might need to really put a lot of money into advertising to keep EasyJet up there because the carriers are going to respond. Likewise, if you want Tempe to bring everybody into it, you might need to renovate very, very quickly because if Tempe doesn't go quickly enough and they get Roosevelt Row up and running, then people are just going to stay downtown because downtown's got a lot of things going for it anyways, et cetera, et cetera. So this here, so again, so these are possible observable processes that might be working in concert to generate growth and stagnation. This together is a potential hypothesis to the question of what causes growth and stagnation. We could say, well, here, this is what we think is going on in every city. And so that brings us to the general kind of scientific method here, where we've got a question that we're investigating. We propose a dynamic hypothesis. That's what's over here. That's our hypothesis. We are going to build that in a computational model and run it. And that will generate predictions that are consistent with our hypothesis. And then we are going to compare our simulated city to a real city. And that has to do with, that's effectively doing our test. And if our simulated city doesn't look like a real city, then that rejects this hypothesis and suggests we need to build an alternative hypothesis and go through this process again. And that alternative hypothesis might be enhanced by the differences that we discovered by doing this. And so it's this iterative process. So to get from hypothesis to prediction, right here, then we build the model, and then we have to figure out realistic parameters. So that might mean we have to go out and do some Googling and see, exactly how long does it take to build new streets, in a particular city. So we need to actually figure out what these delays actually are. Exactly how much land does a particular city have? And, so these are things we need to go out and measure and choose realistic parameters. And then finally, once we have those realistic parameters, then we can run our simulation and then see if our simulation looks anything like the real city. So that's the overall idea of what we do with simulation models, especially in this particular thing. Are there questions about this? Do you see how we're trying to connect model building in simulation to the general process of the scientific method, and I guess more specifically to the sustainability scientific method, or the scientific method in sustainability? Are there questions about this process? Do you see how you might be kind of trying to do this in your final project, hopefully? Okay. All right, so in going from so right now, this hypothesis here, this is a very high scale, it's a very high level hypothesis. So in order for us to actually build the simulation, so I'll say this is high level HL, then we need a little more low level details that we can put into stock and flow diagrams. And so they went into, behind the scenes here, what does that look like? Well, so in Morecroft's model, in Forrester's model, Morecroft featured a couple of different aspects of it within the chapter. These were some of them, and we can zoom in on each one of these things. But as we do, I want you to be thinking about the SIR model that we have seen before, and particularly the IR component, where, if you remember, those who were infected effectively eventually age out of being infected and become recovered over time. And so there's just an average amount of time they stay in this stage. So we call that an age structured model, where you build compartments where you know that eventually you're going to get from one compartment to the other. And what we're really modeling is how long it takes to get from one compartment to the other. So if we zoom in on some of these, then we can again view each one of these. You could view this as like an SIR, or like kind of like an IR and another IR, and that there's going to be a certain amount of construction which will generate enterprises, which will be in this new category. But we know that you can only stay new for so long. So that new restaurant on the corner only stays new and exciting for a certain amount of time. That new store only stays new and attractive for its newness for a certain amount of time. And so we can say, on average, after 2 years or something, then new enterprises become mature businesses. And when they become mature, then maybe they learn how to do the operations or whatever, but still people are attracted to them. But once they've kind of figured out their operations, their prosperity only lasts for a certain amount of time. And so then they inevitably become declining industries. And so then, people stop going to them, they stop being profitable, they can't pay their rent, and then those industries end up churning out. So they end up, becoming demolished. So you can think of this like an age structured population, where you've got birth here, you've got kind of the, maybe adolescence here, you've got your teenage years here, you've got your adulthood, so I'll say grown up here, and then you've got finally death here. So this is just the story, the age structured story of an industry. And you would model it the same way you would model groups of people moving through stages of their life. And then if we were to zoom down and look at housing, we get a similar model, but it has a few more complexities to it. So you still have the birth of premium housing that goes into here. So you can think of this as kind of adolescent or whatever. Now, in some cities, the premium housing eventually, as you get more premium housing, the periphery of a city, the old premium housing that was maybe in the core of the city becomes worker housing. So it's sort of, you actually see this near campuses, depending on how things are zoned, where you can have these beautiful homes that maybe people move out of, they get bought by investment firms, and then a home that used to be, have 8 people, a big 8-person family home gets, maybe they put up a couple more walls and they turn it into 3 apartments. And those 3 apartments are kind of crammed together, but that allows that investment company to then rent them out to college-age students who are looking for places to live. So that's an example where you initially had premium housing becomes housing for a different category of people that still ends up generating economic activity, but in a different sort of way. Now, not only do you get aging of the premium housing into that, but you actually then also have those who just build the housing itself. You say workers need housing, not all of it has to be premium housing that ages into that. Some of it is built fresh as worker housing. Now, eventually, over time, that will age in to underemployed housing. So maybe it'll become slightly less desirable housing, lower income housing, but then also you're going to have some of that housing to be built fresh as well. And then eventually all of these will live out their whole lives, and you get kind of a death of the housing here, and that frees up space for some of these birth processes to happen once again. So that's kind of what's going on there. So any questions about that so far, how we're just gradually making these age structured populations. So these are all stocks and flows that you've learned about, and we're just connecting the stocks in ways to manage the delay as you go through an ordered process of events. So any questions about that? Okay. All right, so then I won't spend a lot more time on this one, but then you can imagine making this far more complicated, where this is actually a population model. And if you look down through here, that the stocks here are modeling different types of people in this population. And so you've got underemployed people here, you've got workers here, and you've got managerial professionals here. And you can see that there's going to be people who are born into each one of these different classes. That's these processes here. And there's also going to be these cases where there will be sort of promotions where workers will end up being promoted into management. And then there's also going to be churn here, where some workers are, for a period of their lives, maybe going back to being unemployed, and those who are unemployed will end up getting transferred up to workers. And so there'll be kind of a back and forth motion here. And ultimately, anyone who's just entering the work population starts out as underemployed. So there is a process here where you can get direct arrivals or births of unemployed who potentially can make it all the way up to managerial professionals. You can get some churn between unemployed and workforce, and then you can also get those who just arrive in each one of these categories independently. And so the departures here, you can imagine they're going to other cities, arrivals coming from other cities, and the births, they're spontaneously being generated from within the city. And in theory, you could go out and measure the rate of these fluxes by looking at studies or statistics that are generated from tax numbers and things like that. All right, so those are all the stocks and flows that go into a major component of Morecroft's or Forrester's model. But once you have all these stocks and flows, then you need to sort of imagine that there's going to be connections between these. And so here, up here, remember, these are the industries, this is the housing, and this is the population. And the movement within these categories will depend in part upon how much is available in the other categories. So the fact that how many new enterprises are available will have an effect on, along with worker housing, on aspects of attractiveness, for example. So the attractiveness of a city is going to depend upon how much housing is available and what industries are available to move into. So, so all of these things can end up working together to affect each other and to affect other aspects of the model. And that's what this complicated coordinating network is supposed to be communicating. Okay, so so basically we've arrived at the point where we started at a basic causal loop diagram that describes our rough idea of how we think a city works. And then we have drilled down into a more detailed stock and flow diagram that is consistent with our causal loop diagram. So this, you can call this thing on the side here the hypothesis. And this is almost a part of the experimental framework on which we test our predictions, or we generate predictions. So this is just a more detailed version of the hypothesis over here. And then we would then run this thing in simulation to generate predictions that are consistent with this hypothesis. And once we have all these stock and flow diagrams, we can run that simulation and we get these things out. These are our behavior over time that come out of our simulation. And these, so this is simulated labor, simulated housing, simulated underemployed, et cetera. So these are all simulated curves. And what's nice about them is that they all seem to share this pattern of urban growth and stagnation. So there are realistic parameters we can find by Googling or for whatever, that when we put into our stock and flow diagrams and hit play or hit simulate, then we end up getting similar trajectories as the real cities. And this allows us to justify why we might be able to then use our simulation model as a toy city for us to then pretend like we're mayor and be able to test different policies. What happens if I cut taxes here? What happens if I increase the land availability here? What happens if I devote money to building new housing here? And so on and so forth. And we can see how it changes these trajectories relative to kind of our base case. And that can tell us what are good things to do in the real world, what are potentially bad things to do in the real world, and what things are just inevitable. They happen regardless of what we do. That's kind of what we'll use this simulation for. So it provides new perspectives on these interactions and allows us to play with something in a way that we can't play with the real world before we start coming up with new policies for the real world. All right, so are there questions about this general process, about this housing model? Again, we're not saying that this is definitely what goes on in every city, but we're saying that if you assume that this is what goes on in every city, the simulation shows us that just those assumptions alone are enough for us to get patterns which look exactly like the patterns we get out of real cities. Okay. So one reason I showed you all that was so that you could have exposure to more ways to use stock and flow diagrams to build these things, with like the different ways to build these together, these age structured models. But the other way is just to kind of demonstrate at a high level this process of moving from question to hypothesis to prediction to test. And so you're going to start with you start with a dynamic hypothesis, and that generates a choice of stock and flows that once you choose your stock and flows, you then can build a coordinating network consistent with your dynamic hypothesis. So you say our hypothesis is that this is related to that, is related to this other thing. We say what stocks are involved in this, that, and the other thing. And then how do I build coordinating networks, so these links, these causal links in between them that are consistent with the hypothesis that I started from. And once I have that coordinating network and the stocks and flows, I can then generate a simulation that tests this dynamic hypothesis. So this is what I'm hoping you're practicing in your final project, is you've identified a cool question, you've identified the dynamic variables that are probably involved in that cool question, you've connected those variables in a way that instantiates a hypothesis for how you think the world works with respect to that question, a potential answer to that question, and then you'll end up using your simulation to see if your hypothesis is right. And if it is, then maybe that allows you to highlight interesting things going on in the real system. And if it's not, then maybe that tells you, like, it can be illustrative to say, oh, well, if the things that I included in my dynamic hypothesis are not enough to generate real world trajectories, then that suggests that something else is going on, that I'm missing something. And that in itself tells you something interesting about the real world. All right, so that's the urban case. Are there any questions about that? Okay.
I'm sorry, I have one question about the way that the textbook described how to keep growth going. Because there was a section that read that it was underneath this graph with the simulated trajectories. And it said that yeah, as long as there was instead of putting more funding into like low-income housing and stuff, wouldn't really attract as much economic growth as building like stuff for new enterprising businesses. And by changing the system so that instead of building more like welfare social stuff, building more like high-end stuff. So would that be gentrification?
You could, I mean, I think you could view that. And so yeah, and gentrification is sort of this idea that you're trying to attract people at kind of a more high economic workers and high economic consumers to areas that in the past were maybe did not have as much economic activity. And so if you buy this model, under this model, if this model is how the world works, then you'll get more bang for your buck. It will be more efficient to invest at the top and allow for the expansion at the top to then bring benefits to maintain the attractiveness of a city, so that people continue to come into a city, people continue to participate in the city, and so on. And so in this model, gentrification will end up helping to sustain growth, whereas propping up those at the bottom will end up making the city less attractive and won't end up increasing any activity. It will end up just sort of supporting the city as it is and potentially causing it to people to leave the city if they don't feel like it's vibrant and active. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying that that this is an example of how you make those arguments, because you're saying that that they've managed to build a model that looks like it predicts exactly what real cities do. And in this model, in this fictitious city, they can show objectively that gentrification is something that will benefit the city as a whole. Now, they may be missing something. There might be other models out there. That's the problem with, normally in science, we work to reject hypotheses because that's kind of the only thing that gives us the most certainty. Showing that you've managed to reproduce exactly what is going on in the real world doesn't necessarily show for certain that you've come up with the right answer, but it at least provides a little bit of support. And then you'd have to continue doing additional work to then try to further verify. But so there could be other models of a city that also produce these behaviors over time. They didn't go through that. Like, you might suggest a model where putting money into worker housing will actually end up sustaining growth. And that might look fundamentally different than the model that that Forrester came up with over here. And you would then have to be able to show that your model which you could hopefully justify every single link logically, also produces growth and stagnation, except when you dump in more money in worker housing, then the growth continues. But Forrester claims that he, couldn't find such a model, and that this was the only model that he found that was a good surrogate for a real city. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. That's really interesting.
All right. Any other questions about this urban dynamics? Again, this isn't a course on, on urban dynamics, but it is a course on the way we can use dynamical models to make arguments. And regardless of how you feel inside your gut about Forrester's opinions, it's the reason why this ended up being very controversial. Regardless of how you feel, because he made this quantitative argument with justifiable links in that causal loop diagram, it is difficult to attack his argument because it's backed up by this quantifiable stuff. It sort of shows us that if we don't feel this is right, then we have a lot of other additional work to do. And it also then suggests that if you put a gun to the head of a policymaker and they had no other information to go on, this model suggests that maybe they should put more effort into premium housing and new enterprise. And if they, and then that would end up being the test. And so you go into a city where you look at one city that puts money here, and you go into another city that puts money here. And then you say, all right, based on these two cities that are otherwise very similar, which one of them ends up seeing more growth after they invest in the money? And this model predicts that this city is going to see more growth than that city. And then if we end up not seeing that, then that is powerful evidence that means that we need to go back and see what's wrong with this model and then learn more about it. But this is kind of like the first step, because like without this model, it's just a crapshoot which one you decide to put money into, this one or this one. But this at least provides some evidence that maybe it's better to try this one than this one up here. But ultimately, in order for us to really know if this model's right, we really need test cities where we put money into both of these and hold all the other variables approximately constant, and then be able to see which one does better. Okay. And so that can also be one of your conclusions, your final projects, is that ultimately your final project might suggest a particular policy for, I don't know, maintaining honeybee populations or something like that. And then so you're not saying for sure that this is how you save the honeybees, but you're saying that before the model, you had no idea. After the model, you're pretty sure that A, B, C are not good policies to save the honeybees, but D, E, and F show potential. And so you are recommending someone try D, E, and F before they try A, B, and C. That's kind of what we try to do in these quantitative models. Okay. All right, so let's jump ahead. Let's do a quick attendance exercise. So I'll put the link in the chat. And the question here is, so the scientific process starts with a causal question, then moves to an answer, a plausible answer we call a hypothesis. And then the hypothesis generates a blank, which we will then test using simulation and real world experiments. So fill in that blank. So what comes after hypothesis in the scientific method? You have question, hypothesis, blank, testing. What is that third one? Okay. All right, so now let's wrap up with the fishery dynamics, which we've seen a lot of so far. I'm going to try to go kind of quickly through some of this stuff because I want to make sure that we learn about this term tipping point and where it comes from and what we mean by it. So Natural fishery, we've seen this fishery here. So this is our standard fishery with no harvesting that we just get, there's fish in this stock and they generate new fish here. And there is a lookup table which governs whether we're going to get a reinforcing feedback. So for all fish densities less than this sort of peak density, we get reinforcing growth. But then for any density greater than this peak density, then we get balancing growth. And so the slope of this lookup table is what determines whether we're getting growing, whether the fish with more density end up producing more fish or producing less fish. So reinforcing with a positive slope, balancing with a negative slope. Now, if we zoom in on that and sort of think about how things happen dynamically, if you you start at high densities, like right here I'm at a high density, then any reduction in fish, say due to harvesting, that's going to cause a reduction in fish, so you'll go to a lower density. And that lower density, because more food becomes available to every fish, is going to lead to a higher reproduction rate. So that suggests that in this realm here of high density, so long as you're in this realm here of sufficiently high density, fishing leads to better conditions for more fishing. So for a while, the more fishing you do, the better it gets for even more fishing. So it's a really good thing to be in. So the fishing actually makes the fish somehow healthier and they reproduce more. But there is a point at low densities where you get the opposite thing that happens. So you start out at this density here, and if you and you're regenerating at this rate here. And so if you are to fish, you're going to take fish out of the fishery, moving you to a lower density. And that moving to a lower density, then now, because you've reduced the number of fish significantly, because competition for food isn't really apparent in this region. So in this region here, this lower region, there's plenty of food for every fish to reproduce. So because reducing the number of fish doesn't reduce competition, because there's plenty of food for all, reducing the number of fish is just going to reduce the number of new fish later. And so reducing the density is going to reduce the regeneration rate. And so in this region down here, a even slight overfishing today leads to massive overfishing tomorrow. So in other words, if the fish are regenerating at this rate, if I'm harvesting at this rate up here, then I'm harvesting more fish than are being regenerated by natural processes. And this gap here between these two is going to cause a decrease in density from this amount of fish to a less amount of fish. And that's just going to reduce the regeneration rate farther, so that the gap, if this is the harvest rate up here, so the gap between harvest and the regeneration rate is even larger, which is going to end up causing an even low or even a greater reduction. And this ultimately is going to lead to extinction. So there is something funny about this intermediate density here. It's almost like we've got two different dynamical systems. On the right, more fishing leads to even better conditions for even more fishing. On the left, more fishing leads to an even faster acceleration to extinction. So the conditions get worse and worse and worse for fishing over time. So we would like to make sure we are fishing in the right-hand side, but we want to make sure we don't fish so much that we move over into the left-hand side. And so this point here is what we're going to end up being calling a tipping point. And so I'm going to get into that definition here in a second. And so, just to kind of hash that out a little bit more in detail, this is exactly the model you built in homework E2. So down here is that lookup table that you see over here. And so if you simulate this, then what we're going to do is we're going to change the number of ships at sea manually. So there's like a little slider on ships at sea, just like you did in your homework E2. And so this ships at sea here, 4, you're going to see that is being changed manually. So it starts out at 0 and then it jumps up to however many ships at sea this is. And when it jumps up to how many ships at sea this is, the catch here, 3, that's going to jump up from 0 catch to this amount of catch. And notice that when that happens, then this curve marked 2, this is the new fish per year. It was originally 0 because the fish were at carrying capacity. They could not produce any more fish. But as you start removing fish, you remove competition for food. So those fish can start reproducing more. So they rise up and eventually level off at exactly the catch. And that is what is a hallmark of a sustainable outcome. The inflow, new fish per year, is equal to the outflow, catch. And when that thing balances out, then the stock of fish up here levels out as well. So that's a sustainable outcome. Now, if I keep going, then I can see, well, I'm going to take, again, ships at sea here. I'm going to say, because things have been going just so well, I'm going to use that slider and I'm going to put more ships out there. So I increase my ships at sea. Well, that is going to increase the catch. And that is going to then cause that regeneration rate, like we were talking, to increase as well. And it'll end up leveling out with the catch, again, sustainable outcome. So the fish stock will get lower because we've taken more fish out, but it levels off as well. So again, sustainable outcome. So then the question is, how far can this go? How far can I keep raising this stock, or raising the number of fish up, raising the number of boats to sea up? And, you know, it's likely that it can't go on forever. So there's going to be at some point where the fish are not going to be able to regenerate. And this is the process that I was just outlining. So you start at one density, you end up fishing, and so you're fishing higher than the regeneration rate. So that is going to end up moving the density lower, and that will raise the regeneration rate up, which then is going to encourage more fishing. So you move and you do more fishing, and then that will end up moving that regeneration rate up. But there is going to be a point where you reach this maximum regeneration rate where it is impossible to generate more fish per year than this particular point. And so that point right there, any catch rate that if you go up any higher than this, you're higher than this maximum regeneration rate. And so there's no way that fish can compensate, and it guarantees that you're just going to get lower and lower and lower densities. So, and that's what's going to end up happening. So that if you stay up here at your catch rate, then your regeneration rate is actually going to get lower as your fish density gets lower. And this is just going to keep on happening further and further until your fish go extinct. Now, it's possible that the industry is going to notice that the catch has declined significantly, and they might respond and say, shoot, we need to save this fishery, and we are going to take our boats out of the fishery and go back to the level of boats that used to be sustainable. So remember, when I started this process, this level of harvest that corresponded to this, to some level of boats, was sustainable. This was a sustainable harvest. But notice that at this density down here, the regeneration rate is lower than the harvest rate. And so even though this used to be sustainable, because I'm in this left region of the plot, the fish can't recover, even though that used to be sustainable. And so they are going to continue this trajectory down into extinction. And that is the key to what I'm going to be referring to as a tipping point, is that we have put the system into a different mode, where in the previous mode, you could sustain whatever, 10 ships on the harbor. But in this new mode, even though you used to be able to have 10 ships out there out there at sea fishing, in this new mode, you can't even support 10 ships. You actually have to go down to 2 ships or no ships and wait for the density to rise again until you go back in to this upper mode where it's safe again. So this tipping point is going to be, it's going to represent a point at which you effectively change the nature of the fishery so that the way you act in the past isn't sustainable actions in the past won't even be sustainable in the future. So that's what's so scary about tipping points. I'll give more examples of that. For a fishery, the tipping point corresponds to what is known as a maximum sustainable yield, which is the density at which the natural resource produces the maximal regeneration rate. And so this is usually roughly half of the carrying capacity, roughly a density of around 0.5, not exactly, but roughly that. And so if you are to move the density in the fishery beneath that, then you cannot simply recover by just going back to whatever you used to do. If you ever move the fish density beneath this maximum sustainable yield density, then that's going to mean that in order to correct the misdeeds that you've done here, you're going to have to allow the fishery a healing period in order to recover. And some damage is unrecoverable. And that is the kind of key thing about this tipping point. And so this diagram this example that they give in the book is just demonstrating exactly this. So if you were to raise the boats beyond the point, so the catch here, again, that's line 3, this catch, if it goes above the maximum regeneration rate, then you are going to hit that tipping point that is going to make it so that the catch is above, that's this thing here, this is the catch, it's line 3. This is above the regeneration rate, so the new fish per year, that's line 2. And so line 2 here, you can see that line 2 is beneath the catch, and it just gets lower and lower and lower. It's farther and farther and farther beneath the catch, and it causes the fish stock to decline rapidly and rapidly and more rapidly, up to the point where even if you try to recover by going back to, remember, this used to be, this level of ships, it was sustainable here. This was a totally reasonable number of ships to put out there in the old days. But now in these new days, if you go back to that same number of ships, because you've done so much damage to the fishery just keeps on declining until extinction. And really the only way you could have recovered is by taking all of your ships off the fishery and wait for the slow process to generate a number of fish to bring you back over the tipping point, back into the realm where it's safe to go back with this number of ships again. So this is why tipping points are so scary, is that they get us into a point where we cannot rescue sustainability, even going back to what used to be sustainable. That's the point of these kind of tipping points. So the maximum sustainable yield is the tipping point of this system. And again, it represents this point where after this point in time, it was not possible to recover sustainability, even with practices that used to be sustainable. So it adds a time dependence. So it responds differently to the same inputs before and after the tipping point. Okay. And so really our only strategy is we just have to remove all the boats in order to actually cause the fishery to recover. All right, I want to give a more abstract case to make this more generalizable to things outside of fisheries. But before I do that, are there questions about this fishery example? Is it clear what happened there, where due to this regeneration curve, where you had a maximal regeneration at an intermediate density, then it was important to make sure that you never, ever bring the fishery less than that maximal density, the maximal regeneration density. It's a little bit like if you want to make sure that you have an annuity, which is basically a giant amount of money in the bank that generates interest. So long as you're spending the interest, you can do whatever you want. But at the point where you draw so much out of the bank that you not only spend your interest, but you spend the principal, then the next year round, you're going to get less interest. And so if you keep spending that amount of money, you're just eating into your principal, and eventually the bank account is going to go dry. If you want that bank account to be sustainable forever, you can only spend the interest. In a fishery, there is a principal and interest, and the maximum sustainable yield density is your principal. You can never tap into the maximum sustainable yield density. If you do, your fishery is guaranteed to go to extinction unless you take drastic action. So is that clear what we mean, and how this dynamic model provides a toy model for us to illustrate this idea of maximum sustainable yield and tipping point? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is jump maybe a little bit out of order in the slides, just to, I might jump back. If you're following along at home, there are a section of slides where I discuss something called a bifurcation diagram. This is a little more advanced topic that is a way in which we look for these tipping points and illustrate them to stakeholders without having to generate lots and lots and lots of simulations and behavior over time plots that we have to stitch together in long narratives. If I have time at the end of class, I'll go back to that bifurcation diagrams. Otherwise, I have some extra video online where, if you like, you can learn about these bifurcation diagrams and how we use them to better communicate these ideas about tipping points in dynamical models. But for now, I want to make sure that we have a general conceptual model of what a tipping point is. That's the really important thing to carry away from this. And so rather than talking about something as specific as a fishery, I'm going to try to come up with a more abstract model for where this tipping point idea comes from. And so imagine a refrigerator that is sitting upright and on the ground, where the ground is represented by this blue square here. If we take that refrigerator and we nudge it just a little bit, then that refrigerator is it might wobble a little bit, but it's going to then stand right back upright. It's going to eventually come to rest upright as expected. So that's when it's sitting like this. Now, if we set it on not level ground and we nudge it just a little, then it will also probably end up, if we just nudge it a little, it's going to wobble a little bit, but as long as it's not tilted that far, it will still end up resting upright. Now, we're going to eventually, if we keep tilting the floor, there will be a point where the center of gravity, so that's what I'm calling here CG, the center of gravity of the refrigerator, will be over the corner, which is the farthest corner where it's making impact with the earth or with the floor. At that point, if you were to nudge this refrigerator just a little, then it won't wobble, it will tip over. It will fall over like that. And at this particular point, it's not going to right itself. Not only is it not going to right itself, but if you were to fix the floor so that it was level again, the refrigerator is going to stay in this new configuration. It will not restore its original position. It is now stable in this turned over position. The only way you can get the refrigerator back into operating condition is actually to take the floor and tilt it the other way to an extreme amount. And that other way will finally end up restoring the refrigerator to this point where it is operational once again. So we stressed the refrigerator out a little bit. And because we could stress out a little bit, we stressed out a little bit more. Eventually it gave way, tipped over, and became like a non-refrigerator. And the only way to get it out of the non-refrigerator mode and get back into the refrigerator mode was actually to take the floor and tip it way back the other way. And then that's finally the way we get our system back. And so that point, this angle here, that angle is referred to as the tipping point. It is the point at which the refrigerator will tip over if it is nudged, if it'll change its configuration. When physicists first came up with this term tipping point, they pictured a glass of wine because I think, as I said earlier, all good research ideas happen over dinner or at a bar. Similarly, physicists might be having discussions over a glass of wine, and this wine glass example came up. And the idea here is that the wine glass has a center of gravity, and when that center of gravity is just over the edge of the wine glass, if you tip the wine glass, it is going to tip over. But the crazy thing about a wine glass is it has liquid in it, and that liquid may spill after it tips over. So even after you right the wine glass, there is no way to get the wine back into the glass. All you can do is wipe up the wine, and then you have an empty glass. So tipping points are often associated with irreversibility. Once the fish go extinct, it does not matter how many boats you put out there. The fish aren't coming back. They're gone for good. That's the danger of tipping points. And when we look at dynamical system models across the globe, we see a bunch of tipping points or potential tipping points in models that we have here. And so I've just got several of them here that are listed, like Arctic sea ice here. So there are models of Arctic sea ice that suggest that we have tipped over. What that means is we have put so much carbon dioxide into the air, we have increased the temperature so much that even if we mitigate things by bringing carbon dioxide back into levels that they were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, the sea ice will not recover. The only way the sea ice is going to recover is if we go into, we freeze the earth, wait for the sea ice to regrow, and then go back to the way things were 60 years ago. That's an example of what we mean by a tipping point being tipped. And there are a bunch of these other examples here where, forests, for example, there's a suggestion that there is a tipping point that is in the Amazon rainforest. And if we go so far, it may not be possible to get the Amazon rainforest to regrow itself unless we take extreme action that goes that's going to constrain our usage of the Amazon rainforest far more than it ever was constrained before. That's the danger of tipping points. So a lot of people use this term tipping point very, very loosely, but it has a specific dynamical meaning, and it is related to this idea that if you overuse a system, you can put that system into a novel dynamical mode where even if you go back to old usage levels, it will not restore itself. The only hope is to go back to usage levels far below what you used to use them at. And even then, it might be lost. The wine might be out of the glass, and you might just be stuck with an empty glass from then on out. That is a tipping point. And there are tons of tipping points. Like I mentioned, political change or climate change, political instability here. So this is an interesting case here where you can model how far people can be pushed until they start, revolting. So, and those can be tipping points as well. So you can say, I have an okay government, I can be a little crappy because my citizenry will take it. And they took it, so I can be a little crappier and a little crappier. And eventually I'm a crap government. And then at that point, I realize that people are so pissed off that they start rebelling and they start wanting to overthrow the government. So what do I do as the government? I say, okay, sorry, I'll return it to the way things were 5 years ago. Isn't that better? But at that point, you've reached a social tipping point where even though things have gone back to the point where people once liked them, the history matters. This hysteresis in the history dependency is the point where the only way you can get them to stop rebelling is to actually go far further than you ever did before. Major concessions. And even then, you might be out of luck that they're just going to overturn the government. Now, tipping points can also be kind of good phenomena. And so this kind of relates to advertising and things like that. So you might put enough effort into driving people to stop a particular behavior. So, or maybe we're like recycling. You're trying to encourage recycling. Well, initially it takes a lot of effort to get people to recycle. So they start recycling, and then gradually they see other people recycling, and it just becomes a word of mouth phenomenon. And at that point, you can stop advertising that people should recycle, and they just recycle on their own. So at that point, you've reached a good tipping point, a tipping point where you start out with no effort and you got no recycling. You put a little effort into it, and as long as you push people over the tipping point, you can then go back to no advertising effort and they'll keep recycling. So there you push them over a tipping point, similar to the political tipping point, but maybe a little more positive. And there are plenty of others. So that's kind of the key thing that I wanted to make sure that you guys got out of that is this definition of a tipping point. There are some additional things that I'd like to cover that we might cover in the next lecture, but I want to make sure that everything's sort of solidified there. Are there questions about what I mean by a tipping point? And what I mean by this whole like back and forth of, you flip from one mode into another to the point where you actually, the only way you can recover is by actually maybe taking action far more restrictive than you'd ever had before. And that marks you having crossed a tipping point. Okay. All right. So I'll put up another attendance question here, and then we'll probably then just wrap up here. So the question here is going to be, give an example system, either one we or I already talked about, or one that seems like a tipping point to you, or seems like one to you, that has a tipping point. So that's the question put in the attendance there. And so as you think about that, the other set of slides that are in the rest of this lecture that if I have time, we can maybe go into next time, is that I want to show how to endogenize exogenous parameters like they did in the book. So in the book, they talked about the number of ships being something that is set by a slider outside of the simulation. And then they endogenized that by building a system where the system itself modeled the psychology of the industry. And that modeling would allow the system to automatically move these ships up and down. And by doing that, it allowed the book to experiment with policy like enforcement strategies, tax strategies, etc., that could encourage people to naturally control their number of boats to prevent going over this tipping point. So that's kind of this idea of endogenizing the exogenous variables is another important thing that I want to make sure you get out of this chapter. And so hopefully that was clear in the chapter, and then I'll probably touch up on that a little bit next week. So with that, there's not many other announcements I have. Like I mentioned, due Sunday night, we've got this Muddiest Point assignment. And then for Tuesday, read chapter 10. It is another one of these where I've said that there's only a certain portions of it you have to read. So pay attention to that and make sure you hit the little continue to next reading button at the bottom perusal if it shows up. And otherwise, that's all I've got for you today. So do you have any questions or comments? And if not, you can head on out. And I also again have office hours on Thursdays as usual, but happy to take some questions here. There's a question about Dexter. Dexter is doing fine. He is in a lull between puppy training and intermediate training, but he is sitting and downing and shaking, all like you might expect from a good puppy. So thanks for asking. Anything else? Right. I hope everybody has a good weekend too, and enjoy the weather. It's a little hot during the day, but but the evenings are beautiful right now. So those of you in Tempe or Phoenix, definitely enjoy that weather this weekend. Okay. In that case, we'll see you all later.